The current Prime Minister is employing a well-worn tactic in central Canada, namely, target Alberta as the bogeyman. Chretien did it before him. Trudeau the Senior did it as well. Perhaps it's because Alberta was created in an attempt to thwart political clout. Going back to 1905, when the province was drawn up and removed from the Northwest Territories, Ottawa always knew it would be a money pit. In early 2001, 6 Albertans, led by Stephen Harper, published an open letter advocating the province adopt the Alberta Agenda. It came to be known as the Firewall Letter. Today, Jason Kenney's Fair Deal panel has a striking resemblance to the Firewall Letter. Will the Fair Deal panel be used as a way of stonewalling the Alberta Agenda in much the same way that former Premier Ralph Klien buried the Firewall Letter? I invited one of the authors of that letter, Tom Flanagan, to join me for this episode of Western Alienation. Mr. Flanagan, thank you for taking the time to join me for this conversation. It's one you've had in the past. If we go back 20 years ago, you were one of the 6 who signed what is now referred to as the Firewall Letter. Do you find it interesting that the concepts that you and yet-to-be Prime Minister Stephen Harper presented to Premier Ralph Klien are now part of the platform of Premier Kenney?
Yeah, it's odd in a way. I thought that the ideas in the letter had kind of disappeared from view. No major party had picked up on them, but they seem to have some relevance to the occasion now, and the government is quite serious about them. But the coronavirus epidemic, pandemic, panic is interfering certainly because people's minds have now been directed for the time being, not permanently, but for the time being, people are thinking about their own personal security. So the ideas in that letter may have to wait a little bit more before they really get adopted.
While the corona pandemic may have slowed the progress of the Fair Deal panel, the pandemic has also revealed there's a lack of sympathy for Alberta's legitimate economic needs in Eastern Canada.
Well, for sure. The government in Ottawa is shoveling money out of the back of the truck as fast as it can, and very little of that is being dedicated to the problems of the oil industry that's so crucial here in Alberta and in Saskatchewan too. There's been the $1 billion or so for shutting down orphan wells, which is fine. But that's not really to keep the industry going for the future. That's kind of like turning out the lights as you leave. And then maybe the industry can get some benefits from some of the other programs, wage subsidies and so forth. But for the very serious problems that the industry faces that have been caused by the government in Ottawa, lack of access to tidewater, so far there's nothing. Now maybe something, there's always hope, maybe something will come. But to this point, it's remarkable how much money has been spent elsewhere, with almost nothing in comparison being spent on our main industry here in the West.
Then to add fuel to the fire, we also had outgoing Green Party leader Elizabeth May and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, who basically said, let Alberta twist in the wind.
Yeah, this is, Elizabeth May and the Bloc leader by themselves, they don't matter that much, but what's frightening, I think, is that view is shared by quite a few people in the Liberal Party and even within the Liberal cabinet. So the word is that there are those who have some sympathy for the problems of Alberta and would like to do something to help the industry, but that there are others that would like to seize this as an opportunity to euthanize the oil and gas industry and to really shut it down to a bare minimum. I guess they want to keep enough oil running to heat their homes in the winter, but other than that, they don't want any growth. So that's what's scary, is that the federal government seems to be internally paralyzed because of views similar to those of Elizabeth May. And that's quite frightening. Now, I mean, many of us have suspected this for a long time, that the real agenda of the Liberal Party was, in fact, to euthanize the oil and gas industry. And the Prime Minister himself has said, more than once that, well, we should leave it in the ground, that we have to phase out the oil sands. So here we see some evidence that our Our fears are justified. We were demonized as being conspiracy theorists, but I mean, it looks like it's coming true.
Yes, I find it interesting that the McMurray Métis quickly responded to that dispatch from the Green Party and the Bloc, saying the last time they checked, the energy sector is not dying. They suggested that these leaders come out and take a look. What I find particularly interesting is that response from the McMurray Métis, and it's only recently that they started to show any kind of appetite for talk about alienation or separation. So now, thanks to the comments from Ms. May and Monsieur Blanchette, alienation and potential separation are topics of interest for the McMurray Métis.
Yeah, well, one of the really important developments of the last few years is the growing coalition between the oil and gas industry and Native peoples in the West, both First Nations and Métis. And the government of Alberta, under Jason Kenney in particular, is trying to cultivate that. They've set up a special fund for helping First Nations to purchase equity shares in major projects, and he's meeting with them frequently. There's all kinds of small things that are not worth talking about right here, but in so many ways, Jason is cultivating this relationship with Native peoples, and this, I think, is going to be politically important in the long term, because of course the First Nations were supposed to be a major part of the Liberal coalition going back to 2015, where Justin Trudeau, really tried to cultivate them. But I think he's losing them in the West because it's a question of livelihood. There are a couple of hundred First Nations here, depending on how you count, but certainly up in the hundreds of First Nations that see their main chance for future prosperity is to be part of the oil and gas industry, whether that is owning a share of pipelines or getting transit fees for the pipelines crossing, or producing oil and gas from their on their reserves or from their traditional territories, or getting contracts to work with the industry. I mean, all of these things come together, and they all produce a chance for prosperity. And now they fear that it's going to be snuffed out. So anyway, this is something to look for in the future, is this growing coalition between the governments. Well, it's Saskatchewan too, but Alberta is the big player with the Native peoples.
Well, you have an extensive understanding of the relationship between Indigenous people who live under the Indian Act and their relationship with Alberta and with Ottawa. And in the past, that relationship has not been good, and I realize that's an understatement. However, moving forward, the relationship between First Nations and governments in Alberta and Ottawa is central to economic development and growth for everyone.
Yeah. Well, if I can use some of the terms I used in my recent book, The Wealth of First Nations, the relationship between Ottawa and the First Nations for decades was one of taking. That the real issue was how much money could the First Nations extract from Ottawa in the form of higher appropriations and transfer payments, whereas what Alberta now is proposing is not taking but making, allowing the First Nations to become prosperous by making them part of the economy, making them producers, producing oil and gas, or doing constructive and creative things like building pipelines and servicing and so forth, but making them part of the economy rather than having them outside the economy but being supported by transfer payments. So there's really two very different visions of the future that are at stake here.
That's a message that we're hearing from Perry Bellegarde at the national level, Ellis Ross and Chris Sankey in British Columbia, Joe Dion in Alberta, Delbert Wattpass in Saskatchewan, and many others who are saying, let's work together and share prosperity. And it is a complete reversal of the past mindset of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, and it's required a lot of movement on both sides. The oil and gas industry had to move because traditionally their approach was, they move in, they pump it out, they pay some royalties, but they don't leave much behind, and the First Nations or the Métis don't really participate in it. They're just kind of bystanders. And naturally, the First Nations and the Métis were suspicious of this, and they were all afraid of what would happen to to their lands. So both sides had to move, and I've been watching this happen now over the last few years, leaders from both sides coming together, series of conferences, roundtables. It's taken a big leap forward with the election of Jason Kenney, who's really dedicated to this. But we have the now these huge problems. I mean, the collapse of the economy from the coronavirus panic, which I believe will be temporary, but it's very severe while it lasts. But then there's bigger problems in the background of lack of access to tidewater, through pipeline construction. Now maybe that can be overcome, but we don't know for sure yet. Trans Mountain Pipeline is not yet completed. People are working on it, but will it actually ever be completed? Also, the one into the United States is running into new obstacles. It seems like there are obstacles everywhere. So it's a work in progress, and there's hope for sure. But I like to say I'm a conservative, so I'm never optimistic, but I'm always hopeful.
As you speak, I'm reminded of how important relationships between First Nations and anyone who wants to develop natural resources are in this country. First Nations have the weight of the law on their side. Post Silcotin and Delgamuukw, without First Nations partnerships, resource development in Canada won't happen. So with that, many First Nations leaders are now looking to environmental NGOs and saying, you used us for your agenda with no regard for ours. You got what you wanted and left us in poverty. So now we're seeing a growing number of First Nations leaders and First Nations business leaders who are turning to the resource sector as a path towards prosperity. They, in essence, are saying, we want to work with you.
It's not just oil and gas, of course. It's hard rock mining and it's forestry. It's fisheries, even agriculture in some parts of the country. So it's a broad spectrum of natural resources. So I think it's a very healthy development, and one that holds a lot of potential for the future. And it would be ironic to have it be frustrated by a Liberal government which has claimed to be the great proponent of Native peoples. But at the moment, it seems to me they're more in the way than anything else.
Do you think the current sense of alienation is going to give rise to the concept of separation? Because in the latest poll, upwards of 25% of Albertans are saying, I'm not just feeling alienated, I want out of Canada.
Yeah, that feeling is there, and it could grow. Could it become a majority opinion? I don't know. I guess it depends on how bad things are. I mean, most Albertans, I'm sure their first preference would be a better deal within Canada, and to have the federal government stop blocking our major industries. But if the federal government continues on its course, as I say, right now, in the middle of the COVID panic, people are afraid and thinking about other things. So you wouldn't get a strong support for separatism right now. But once we get out of this situation, then I think these long-term problems are going to reassert themselves.
Do you think there's an actual legal path towards separation? And I ask that because in reading the Clarity Act, it's unclear to me that would be possible. And from my perspective, I think it would be virtually impossible without the agreement of First Nations.
Well, some of those questions are above my pay grade, I'm afraid. These are very deep issues of constitutional law, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I have to say the legal obstacles are very formidable. There is a theoretical pathway towards independence involving perhaps a provincial referendum, but the deck is stacked in the favor of the central government. The Parliament has to certify that the question is a fair question before it's ever asked, and then afterwards it has to certify that it's a clear majority. None of these terms are well defined, so it's going to depend on who controls the Parliament at the time. And then it's going to require a constitutional amendment if it's going to be done in an orderly and legal fashion. But there are different constitutional amending formulas, and if it's going to require the unanimity formula, then it could be blocked by any one province. Now again, this is not clear. I don't think it's clear what formula you would have to use. But if you're forced into using the unanimity formula, so the legal roadblocks are large, immense actually. So, and then you ask about the First Nations, and there I honestly don't know what that's never really been tested. There was talk of that when Quebec was close to separation, but in fact it didn't happen. So we don't really know. Yeah, I don't know. So realistically, separation may be more useful as a threat than anything else. I mean, even if it's not something that could happen, just talking that way and moving in that direction is very alarming to the rest of the country and to investors, and so it could conceivably bring about. I mean, look at the advantages that Quebec has reaped by using the separation threat. Maybe it was never realistic. Some people think it was never realistic, but it has certainly made federalism more profitable for them in Quebec. Long series of concessions over decades because of the threat of separation. So maybe that's the role it may play out here in the politics of the West.
Well, I'd like to come back to the Fair Deal panel and get your thoughts on how it mirrors the points you and others put forward in the Alberta Agenda, otherwise known as the Firewall Letter. In particular, the development of an Alberta pension plan, an Alberta Police Department, and other elements. How do these strengthen Alberta's place in the makeup of Canada?
Well, let's look at the big picture here. There's really three options for Alberta. One would be exercising greater influence within the central government in Ottawa, and that was really what Preston Manning tried to do with his slogan of "The West Wants In." Maybe it worked temporarily, but in the long term, I don't really think it has worked. But anyway, that's one option: is greater influence in the Senate. That's what Senate reform was supposed to achieve. But Senate reform, I think, is dead. The Supreme Court has killed it. At the other extreme, you have separation. Okay, then in between them, there's a kind of a not terribly well-defined concept of greater autonomy for Alberta and possibly for other provinces too, in which Alberta would take greater responsibility within and a lot of this doesn't even require a constitutional amendment, but Alberta would take greater responsibility for its own affairs. Ironically, Alberta would become more like Quebec. Quebec has its own pension plan. Quebec has its own police force. Quebec has a special tax arrangement with Ottawa. But that's the general idea, is of a looser federal system with greater autonomy for those provinces that wish to exercise it. So the specifics of a pension plan and so forth are perhaps less important than the general idea of a more autonomous Alberta. And the vision actually goes back to the original letter, the so-called Firewall Letter. Well, a firewall is something that's supposed to protect you from external damage. So the idea was to make Alberta better protected against raids from voting majorities in central Canada.
How would you characterize or grade the sentiment and the status of the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa in 2020?
Well, I think it's a difficult to grade because we're in an abnormal situation because of the coronavirus panic. So all normal politics is kind of suspended. So it's kind of hard to give a reading on that. But if you try and bracket that out, I think our relationship with Ottawa is kind of at a low point, but possibly improving if we do get completion of the TMX pipeline, if we do get completion of Line 3, if we do get completion of the TSX line into, or was it the extension into the United States, that will solve the access problem for our oil. But the world market is like this kind of outside our control. But Saudi Arabia and Russia are sort of ganging up in a way to try and diminish the role of North American producers. Who knows how that's going to work out? Ottawa has made a lot of further projects almost impossible to contemplate. So we may come out of this with some improvement for a while, but then I think a few years from now, if oil markets pick up, even the new pipelines will be full, and then we'll have the situation, well, we can't have Northern Gateway, we can't have Energy East, we can't have big new oil sands mines. Big projects become almost impossible under Bill C-69. So we may have some temporary improvement in some ways for a few years, but the fundamental problem remains is that the resources are in the West and the voting population is in the East. And that sets up an overwhelming temptation for politicians to exploit that situation by appropriating the wealth that's generated in the West and distributing it in the East. One wag has described contemporary Canadian elections as a process by which the voters of Ontario decide how much money will be taken from the West to give to Quebec. So that long-term, that's been the situation, ever since Confederation, and it remains. And I think it will remain unless there's some large movement of people to the West. There has been, but not enough to offset the growth, continued growth in Ontario. So, yeah, so I think we're at a low point right now. I'm hopeful for maybe some short-term improvements, but the long-term problems remain.
Mr. Flanagan, thank you ever so much for your time and insights.